December 20th, 1943. The skies over Germany are a frozen, metal-gray slaughterhouse. Below, a B-17 bomber, Ye Olde Pub, is a flying wreck. Its engines are failing, its tail gunner is dead, and its crew is bleeding out. It is alone, defenseless, and has minutes to live. Suddenly, a German Bf-109 fighter appears, its cannons loaded, its pilot, the angel of death. The German ace pulls alongside the crippled American bomber. The two pilots lock eyes across the void. This is the end. But the German doesn't fire. Instead, he raises his hand and salutes. The German pilot held the salute, then peeled his fighter away, vanishing into the clouds. Against all odds, Ye Olde Pub limped out of German airspace and crash-landed at an RAF base in England. 10 men survived that day because of one impossible choice. Their pilot, Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown, would eventually go home. He would build a life, raise a family. But for 43 years, a single haunting question would remain buried deep in his mind. Who was the enemy pilot who looked him in the eyes and chose mercy instead of murder? Charlie Brown landed that flying coffin at RAF Seething. Ground crews stared in disbelief. The B-17, Ye Olde Pub, was so riddled with holes and shell damage that it looked like scrap metal. It was a miracle it hadn't disintegrated in the air. But the real shock came during the debriefing. Charlie told his commanding officers exactly what happened. He explained how a German fighter didn't just spare them, but had actually escorted them to the edge of the North Sea. The response was not relief or celebration. It was immediate and cold. He was ordered, "Never speak of this again. Don't tell the crew. Don't tell other pilots." Why? If word got out that a German pilot could show mercy, it might create dangerous sentiment. The official line was clear. You cannot be human and fly in a German cockpit. The mystery was now a forbidden secret. So Charlie Brown stayed silent, just as he was ordered. He completed his combat tour, flew more missions, and returned home to West Virginia. He did everything a man was supposed to do. He went to college, rejoined the Air Force, served until 1965, and even became a State Department Foreign Service officer. He built a career, raised a family, and retired. On the surface, he was a decorated American hero. But in private, the war had never released its grip. His daughter would later recall her father's nightmares. She remembered him waking up in a cold sweat, shaking from visions of flak and dying crewmen. But always, underneath the chaos of combat, was that one haunting, silent image. The German pilot in the cockpit of his Bf-109 looking right at him. The man he was never allowed to talk about. Charlie Brown wasn't the only one haunted by the secret. Thousands of feet below, the German pilot, Franz Stigler, landed his fighter near Bremen. He refueled his plane and reported nothing. He said nothing to his commanding officers, nothing to his ground crew. Franz knew the rules. What he had done wasn't an act of honor. In Nazi Germany, it was treason. Sparing an enemy bomber in combat was a court-martial offense, and the penalty was absolute: execution. If anyone discovered that he had deliberately let 10 Americans escape, he would face a firing squad. Charlie Brown was silenced by an order. Franz Stigler was silenced by the threat of death. Franz Stigler survived the war, but his country did not. He endured the collapse of Germany, the chaos of defeat, and the occupation. The world he knew was gone. In 1953, he left the ruins of his homeland behind and immigrated to Canada, settling in Vancouver. He was a man starting over. He built a new life, became a successful businessman, and, like Charlie, tried to bury the past. But the past would not be buried. He, too, tried to move on. But for decades, the memory of that day in December 1943 remained. He never forgot the sight of that shattered bomber, the massive holes in its fuselage, or the young American pilot who looked back at him, terrified, through the cockpit window. For 4 decades, 2 men lived on opposite sides of the world, separated by an ocean and the memory of a war. One, an American veteran. The other, a former German ace living a quiet life in Canada. They were invisibly linked by a single shared secret. A 10-minute encounter in the skies over Germany that neither man could forget and neither man could speak about. It was a moment that had marked them both permanently. 2 lives defined by one impossible act suspended in silence, waiting for history to catch up. The silence holds for 43 years. Then the story jumps to 1986. Charlie Brown, now 64 years old and a retired Air Force colonel, is attending a combat pilot reunion in Boston called the Gathering of the Eagles. It's an event to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the B-17's first flight. During the event, someone casually asks Charlie if he had any memorable missions during the war. He thinks for a moment. The order to stay silent had expired with the war, but the habit of silence had hardened over decades. And then he makes a choice. For the first time, he tells the story. He tells everyone about the crippled bomber, the dying crew, the German fighter that appeared on their wing, and the salute. The 43-year-old secret is finally out. When Charlie finished, the room was stunned. A story like this defied all logic of the war they had fought. Other pilots immediately gathered around him, their voices a sudden flood of questions. Who was he, Charlie? Did he survive the war? How have you gone 40 years without ever trying to find him? Charlie looked at the faces around him, all mirroring the one question he had buried for a lifetime. The 43-year-old mystery was no longer just his. He realized he didn't just want an answer. He needed one. He had to find him. The quest began with determination, but quickly met a wall of cold, bureaucratic silence. Charlie Brown started with the official channels. He was a retired colonel, after all. He wrote to the U.S. Air Force. He contacted the West German Air Force archives. He filed requests with the Army Air Force's Historical Office. He was searching for any documentation of Luftwaffe units stationed near Bremen on December 20th, 1943. Months passed, then a year, then 2, 3, 4. The search was hopeless. The records didn't exist, or they were incomplete, or they'd been lost. The German military archives had been scattered across a divided Germany. The Luftwaffe's detailed records, once meticulous, had been largely destroyed in the war or captured by the Soviets. Finding one specific pilot from one specific day 4 decades gone was like finding a ghost. It was dead end after dead end. But Charlie couldn't let it go. His nightmares continued, the cold sweats, the haunting image of the German pilot. The search was no longer just about curiosity. It was about finding the one man who held the key to his past and his peace. After 4 years of failures, the official channels were clearly exhausted. In 1989, Charlie decided to try a different approach, one last, desperate attempt. He sat down and wrote a detailed account of the entire incident. He described the date, the location, the circumstances, the B-17's call sign, and the markings on the BF-109. He sent this letter to a niche newsletter for combat pilots, a publication read by a small, aging community of both American and German veterans. He included every detail he could remember, but he made sure to emphasize the one defining, impossible clue, the clue that had haunted him for decades. The German pilot had looked directly at him and given a salute. He sent the letter and waited. He was 67 years old. He had no idea if the man was even still alive, but he had to try. January 1990. A combat pilot newsletter arrives at the home of Franz Stigler in Vancouver, Canada. He is 74 years old. He opens it and begins to read. Then he stops. His eyes fix on a letter from an American pilot named Charlie Brown. Franz reads the date, December 20th, 1943. He reads the location, the details of the crippled B-17, and the mention of a salute. It all matches. For Franz, this is a revelation. For 47 years, he had wondered if the bomber had crashed into the North Sea. Now he knew. They survived. They made it home. He immediately sat down and wrote a letter. He sent it to Charlie Brown in Miami. Days later, Charlie received an envelope from Canada. He opened it. The letter began with 4 simple words. I was the one. Charlie Brown, letter in hand, dialed the number for Vancouver. He was stunned, his heart pounding. On the other end of the line, a man with a German accent answered. It was Franz Stigler. As they spoke, Franz calmly recited the facts of the day. He described the B-17's specific damage, the shattered nose, the dead tail gunner, the exact location over the North Sea. He recounted details only the pilot in the other cockpit could have possibly known. For Charlie, it was a moment of profound release. The 43-year-old question that had fueled his nightmares, the haunting image from his past, finally had an answer. The ghost had a name and a voice. But as the 2 men talked, one mystery was replaced by a deeper, more urgent one. It was no longer about who, it was about why. Why would an enemy pilot with a kill in his sights risk a court-martial and execution just to save a plane load of men he was supposed to destroy? Over the phone, Franz Stigler finally answered the 47-year-old question. He explained to Charlie that when he was a young fighter pilot, his commanding officer, Gustav Rödel, had given his men an ironclad rule. Franz remembered the words clear as day. If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself. That was the code. You fight with honor, or you are no better than a murderer. When Franz pulled alongside the crippled B-17, he didn't see an enemy. He saw the full extent of the damage. He saw the holes in the fuselage, the dead tail gunner, the desperate crew inside trying to save their own. They were helpless. To me, Franz explained to Charlie, the men in that shattered bomber were no different than men hanging from parachutes. They weren't a threat. They were just trying to survive. To shoot them down would not be combat. It would be murder. So, he made a choice. He didn't just spare them. He escorted them, flying on their wing to protect them from their own German flak positions. The phone call was the answer. But the healing wasn't complete until 6 months later. The 2 men arranged to meet in person in Seattle. A camera was there to capture the moment. Franz Stigler, now 75, stepped out of a car. He saw Charlie Brown waiting for him. He didn't walk. He ran. These 2 men, once sworn enemies, separated by the most brutal war in history, ran to embrace each other. They held on, 2 old men, weeping in the middle of a hotel lobby. Decades of nightmares, silence, and unanswered questions evaporated in that single moment. The war, for them, was finally over. As they held each other, Franz Stigler turned to the camera, his voice thick with emotion, and said softly to the man whose life he had saved 47 years earlier, I love you, Charlie. That meeting in Seattle wasn't an end. It was the beginning of the final, most important chapter of their lives. From 1990 until their deaths, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler became inseparable. They spoke on the phone every single week. They traveled across the United States together, appearing at air shows and veteran gatherings, standing side by side to tell their story. The impact of their reunion was profound. For Charlie, the nightmares that had plagued him for over 4 decades, the cold sweats, the haunting image of the enemy pilot, stopped. Completely. The ghost was gone, replaced by his friend. For Franz, the healing was just as powerful. He had lost his own brother in the war and seen his country destroyed. He would later say that meeting Charlie and the crew he saved and seeing their families was the only good thing that came out of World War II for him. It was the ultimate proof that his one act of humanity had mattered. Their friendship deepened into family. The bond extended beyond the two pilots. Charlie's wife and Franz's wife became close friends. During one of their visits, Franz gave Charlie a book as a gift. Inside, he had written a simple, powerful inscription. In 1940, I lost my only brother as a night fighter. Thanks, Charlie. Your brother, Franz. This bond, however, was not understood by everyone. Franz received calls from people in Germany calling him a traitor for what he did. Some of his own neighbors shunned him. But for the two men, those labels were meaningless. German, American, enemy, friend. These were just words from a war that had ended decades ago. What mattered was the brotherhood they had found. Their brotherhood lasted 18 years. On March 22, 2008, Franz Stigler died in Vancouver, Canada. He was 92. 8 months later, on November 24, 2008, Charlie Brown died in Miami, Florida. He was 86. They're buried thousands of miles apart, but their story remains inseparable. It was as if, after finally finding each other, neither could exist long without the other. Their story became a best-selling book. But the true legacy isn't the fame, it's the simple, profound truth they proved. That's not just a war story. That's a story about what it means to be human.